At 0640 on September 14, 1943, something changed in the field hospital behind the Salerno beachhead. The surgeons couldn't explain it. Post-operative infection rates dropped from 43% to 12% in 72 hours, then to 6% by the end of the week. Soldiers who should have died from sepsis walked out of the recovery tent. Men who had been delirious with fever 48 hours earlier were sitting up, eating, talking. The chief surgeon, Colonel Harrison, ordered an investigation. What had changed? New antibiotics shipped from North Africa? Better surgical technique? A change in wound care protocols? Divine intervention? None of those. The answer was in a corner of the supply tent, where Lieutenant Margaret Hastings, 28-year-old Army nurse from Pennsylvania, had built something she wasn't authorized to build. A steam sterilizer. Made from a pressure cooker, copper pipes, and medical tubing salvaged from damaged ambulances. It looked like something from a moonshine operation. A Rube Goldberg contraption that violated at least 6 Army Medical Corps regulations. The kind of improvised equipment that got people court-martialed, and it was saving 15 lives per week. When Colonel Harrison discovered what Maggie had done, he had 2 choices. Court-martial her for unauthorized medical equipment and gross violation of military protocol, or admit that a nurse with $12 in scrap metal had solved a problem the Army Medical Corps couldn't fix in 25 years. If you want to see how Maggie's impossible contraption changed battlefield medicine forever, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Maggie. The Salerno landing began on September 9, 1943. Operation Avalanche. 55,000 Allied troops hitting Italian beaches against German defensive positions that had been fortified for months. The Germans expected the landing. They had positioned the 16th Panzer Division in the hills overlooking the beaches. They had zeroed their artillery on every approach route. The landing was brutal. 5th Army suffered 2,000 casualties in the first 24 hours. By September 11th, casualties exceeded 4,000. The 351st Field Hospital set up 12 miles inland on September 11th, in an olive grove near the town of Battipaglia. The location provided some cover from German observation, but remained within artillery range. The hospital consisted of 14 large tents arranged in a functional layout, receiving, triage, pre-op, 3 surgery tents, post-op recovery, supplies, and administration. Lieutenant Margaret Hastings arrived with the initial medical detachment. She was one of 47 Army nurses assigned to support 3 surgical teams. The nurses had trained together at Fort Sam Houston in Texas for 8 months before deployment. They had practiced setting up field hospitals in simulated combat conditions. They had learned to work under artillery fire, to perform triage under pressure, to function with minimal equipment. But nothing had prepared them for the reality of Salerno. Before the war, Maggie had worked at Philadelphia General Hospital for 6 years. She'd started as a floor nurse in 1937, worked her way up to surgical nursing by 1940. She'd seen the transition from alcohol sterilization to pressurized steam in civilian medicine. She'd watched the infection rates drop year after year as hospitals adopted the new technology. The difference was measurable. Philadelphia General's post-operative infection rate dropped from 38% to 4% between 1935 and 1939. The hospital had installed steam sterilizers in every surgical suite. The devices were massive, 400 pounds, 6 feet tall, requiring dedicated electrical systems and water supplies. But they worked. Surgeons who had watched patients die from post-operative infections for decades suddenly saw those deaths become rare. The Army hadn't made that transition. Field hospitals still used World War I protocols. Surgical instruments were wiped with alcohol-soaked gauze between patients. Sometimes the gauze was reused if supplies ran low. The instruments went from one patient to the next with minimal cleaning. The logic was simple. Alcohol killed bacteria on contact. It was fast. It was portable. It didn't require heavy equipment or specialized training. Medics could clean instruments in seconds and move on to the next surgery. But it didn't kill everything. Alcohol sterilization was effective against most bacteria at surface level. The alcohol evaporated quickly, leaving instruments dry and ready for use. But certain pathogens, Staphylococcus aureus, Clostridium perfringens, Streptococcus pyogenes, could survive in microscopic crevices on surgical instruments. The hinges of hemostats where metal components met. The serrations on forceps where tissue could lodge. The joints of retractors where blood could accumulate. These tiny spaces provided protection from the alcohol. Those bacteria multiplied during surgery. They entered wounds. They colonized damaged tissue. They caused infections that developed 24 to 48 hours post-operation. The infections were often fatal. Antibiotics existed by 1943, but supplies were limited. Penicillin was reserved for the most critical cases. Sulfa drugs helped some patients but not all. Many soldiers simply died. By September 13th, the 351st Field Hospital had performed 127 surgeries. 54 patients developed post-operative infections. 23 died from sepsis. A 42% infection rate. An 18% death rate. The numbers were devastating. Maggie watched soldiers survive German artillery, survive the chaos of the beach landing, survive battlefield trauma that should have killed them, then die from infections 2 days later. She watched young men, 19 and 20 years old, succumb to fevers that burned through their bodies. She watched them become delirious, thrashing in their cots, calling for their mothers. She held their hands as they died, and she knew it didn't have to be this way. She knew the solution. Steam sterilization, pressurized heat at 15 psi, 250 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained for 15 minutes. It killed every known pathogen. It reached into every crevice. It penetrated every microscopic space where bacteria could hide. It left instruments completely sterile, safer than new instruments straight from the factory. But the Army didn't have steam sterilizers in field hospitals. Those devices weighed 400 pounds. They required stable power sources, 110-volt electrical systems that field hospitals didn't have. They required constant water supplies. They were designed for permanent facilities, not mobile medical units 12 miles from active combat that might have to relocate with 6 hours' notice. Maggie requested one anyway. She submitted a formal equipment requisition to Colonel Harrison on September 12th. She filled out the forms properly, following every procedure she'd learned in training. She detailed the problem, high infection rates from inadequate sterilization. She proposed the solution, field portable steam sterilizer. She cited the civilian hospital data from Philadelphia General. She calculated that a sterilizer would save an estimated 30 lives per month based on current casualty rates. The request went through proper channels. Medical supply at division level. Division quartermaster for equipment procurement. Theater Logistics Command for authorization and funding. The response came back in 18 hours. Request denied. No steam sterilizers available for field deployment. No budget allocation for experimental equipment. Equipment procurement priorities focused on surgical supplies and antibiotics. Recommend adherence to standard sterilization protocols. Requests submitted to long-term planning for consideration in future procurement cycles. Translation: maybe in 6 months, maybe never. Standard protocols were killing soldiers at a rate of 3 per day. Maggie made a decision that would either save lives or end her military career. If the Army wouldn't provide the equipment, she'd build it herself. The supply tent held equipment from 3 damaged ambulances. The vehicles had been hit by artillery during the initial landing. 2 were total losses. 1 might be repairable eventually. Maggie had watched the mechanics cannibalize parts over the past week. Radiators for cooling systems, fuel lines for repairs, pressure gauges for diagnostic equipment. They were scavenging what they could before the wrecks were hauled to salvage depots somewhere in North Africa. She asked Corporal Danny Reeves, the senior mechanic, if she could take some parts. Reeves was 32 years old, from Michigan, had worked as an auto mechanic before the war. He'd kept half the vehicles in the medical unit running despite lacking proper tools and spare parts. He asked what for. She explained. Steam sterilization, pressure cooker, copper tubing, medical instruments. He thought she was insane. Ma'am, he said, with all due respect, you want to build a what? A steam sterilizer, Maggie repeated. Like they use in civilian hospitals. Out of a pressure cooker. Yes, in a combat zone. Yes. Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, you know this is going to get us both court-martialed. Probably, Maggie agreed, and you're doing it anyway. I am. The base component was a pressure cooker. Maggie found one in the mess tent. The cooks used it for preparing large batches of vegetables. Capacity 16 quarts. Maximum pressure rating 15 psi. Perfect for sterilization. Maggie asked the mess sergeant if she could borrow it. He asked why. She said it was for a medical experiment. He said he needed it back by dinner service. She promised she'd return it or replace it. The problem was adapting it. A standard pressure cooker had a single release valve on top. The valve let excess pressure escape to prevent explosions. But Maggie needed controlled steam input and output. She needed a way to maintain consistent pressure throughout the sterilization cycle. She needed a containment system for the instruments that would allow steam to circulate around every surface. Reeves provided the engineering knowledge. Maggie provided the medical specifications. They worked for 3 nights after their regular duties, 2,100 hours to 200 hours, 5-hour shifts after 12-hour days, in the supply tent, by lantern light, while German artillery occasionally rumbled in the distance. The design evolved through trial and error. Reeves had experience with pressure systems from working on automotive cooling systems. Maggie had observed steam sterilizers in operation at Philadelphia General. Together they figured out what would work with the materials available. The design was simple but functional. The pressure cooker formed the sterilization chamber. Its existing pressure relief valve would prevent catastrophic failure. Copper tubing from a damaged ambulance radiator, 3 8-inch diameter, 8 feet total length, connected to the release valve using compression fittings. Reeves fabricated from brass nuts. The tubing directed steam away from the work area, venting it outside the tent where it wouldn't scald anyone. A pressure gauge from an ambulance fuel system mounted on the cooker lid using a custom bracket. Reeves welded. The gauge measured 0 to 30 psi, more than sufficient for monitoring sterilization pressure. Maggie could watch it during operation and adjust heat to maintain exactly 15 psi. Medical instrument trays from the surgery tent. Perforated stainless steel designed for holding surgical tools. Fit inside the chamber with half-an-inch clearance on all sides. The perforations allowed steam to circulate around every instrument. Multiple trays could be stacked, separated by small spacers. Reeves cut from salvaged metal stock. The heat source was a Coleman camp stove. 3 burners. Propane-fueled. Salvaged from a bombed Italian farmhouse near the beachhead. Someone had brought it to the hospital, thinking it might be useful. Now it was. Total cost $0 in official procurement. Total weight 31 pounds when empty. 39 pounds when loaded with instruments and water. Portable enough to move between tents. 2 people could carry it easily. On September 14th at 0400 hours, Maggie tested it. She filled the pressure cooker with distilled water from the medical supplies. 2 quarts, enough to generate steam for 15 minutes without boiling dry. She placed a full set of surgical instruments inside. Scalpels, hemostats, forceps, retractors, needle holders. The instruments were already dirty from the previous day's surgeries, perfect for testing. She sealed the lid, ensuring the rubber gasket seated properly. She connected the copper tubing to the vent. She positioned the whole assembly on the Coleman stove. She lit the burners at 0407 hours. The water boiled in 8 minutes. She could hear it bubbling inside the chamber. Steam began venting through the copper tubing, creating a small plume outside the tent. The pressure gauge climbed slowly. 2 psi, 4 psi, 7 psi. Pressure built to 15 psi at 0427 hours, 12 minutes after ignition. Maggie adjusted the burner flames, reducing heat slightly to maintain steady pressure without going over. The gauge held steady at 15 psi. She watched it carefully, making small adjustments every few minutes. The timing was critical. Too little pressure wouldn't kill all bacteria. Too much pressure risked damaging the cooker or creating a safety hazard. She maintained 15 psi for exactly 15 minutes. At 0442 hours, she turned off the burners. Then she waited. Pressure had to release slowly. Opening the cooker too soon would cause explosive decompression. Steam turning instantly to water. Instruments flying everywhere. Severe burns for anyone nearby. She released pressure gradually through the vent tube over 5 minutes. The gauge dropped steadily. 12 psi, 9 psi, 5 psi, 0. At 0452 hours, she opened the lid. The instruments were completely dry. The heat of sterilization had evaporated all moisture. No water spots. No residue. The metal gleamed, slightly warm to the touch. And according to the principles Maggie had learned in civilian hospitals, completely sterile. She had no way to test for bacteria in a field hospital. No laboratory equipment. No microbiological analysis capability. No culture medium to grow bacteria and confirm they were dead. She would have to prove effectiveness through results, through infection rates, through soldiers living or dying. At 063 hours, the first surgery of the day began. German artillery had hit an infantry position at dawn. Shells had landed in a trench where a squad was preparing for morning patrol. 3 casualties. 2 required immediate surgery. 1 with shrapnel wounds to the abdomen, another with compound fractures in the left arm from blast impact. Maggie sterilized the instruments with her device before the operations. She didn't tell the surgeons. She didn't tell anyone. She just placed the instruments on the standard trays, covered them with sterile drapes, and brought them into the surgery tent exactly as she always did. The operations proceeded normally. The surgeon, Major William Patterson, worked quickly. The abdominal case took 38 minutes. The shrapnel had perforated the small intestine in 2 places. Patterson repaired the perforations, irrigated the abdominal cavity, closed in layers. The arm fracture took 22 minutes. Set the bones, placed a fixation rod, closed the wound. Both soldiers survived surgery. Neither developed infections. Maggie used the sterilizer for every surgery that day. 7 operations, 7 successful procedures. She sterilized instruments in batches between cases, timing her work so fresh instruments were ready when surgeons needed them. 0 infections developed in the following 48 hours. On September 15th, 8 more surgeries. 0 infections. On September 16th, the pattern was clear. Post-operative infection rate had dropped to 12%. Soldiers who should have been developing fevers were showing normal temperatures. Wounds that should have been showing red inflammation were healing cleanly. The recovery tent had a different atmosphere. Less urgency. Less fear. Fewer soldiers dying in the night. By September 18th, infection rate was 6%. The lowest it had been since the hospital opened. Soldiers were surviving. But Maggie was operating in secret. She sterilized instruments in the supply tent, away from the surgery area where surgeons and other nurses might see. She timed her work for early morning, before surgical teams assembled for the first cases. She worked by lantern light at 0400 hours, alone preparing instruments while everyone else slept. She didn't document the process. She didn't submit reports. She didn't tell Colonel Harrison what she was doing. She knew that if he discovered the unauthorized equipment, he would shut it down immediately. Regulations were regulations.
The Army had procedures for introducing new medical equipment. Those procedures involved testing, approval, procurement, distribution through proper channels. They didn't involve nurses building contraptions from salvaged parts. Harrison discovered it on September 20th. He was conducting a supply inventory, routine procedure after the first week of operations. Field hospitals had to account for all equipment and supplies, medical instruments, drugs, bandages, everything. The inventory helped identify shortages and generate requisitions. He found the sterilizer in the corner of the supply tent, hidden behind crates of bandages. He stared at it for several seconds, trying to understand what he was looking at. A camp stove, all assembled into something that looked like an explosion waiting to happen. He summoned Maggie immediately. The conversation was brief. Harrison demanded an explanation. Maggie provided one. Steam sterilization to reduce post-operative infections. She explained the civilian hospital data. She explained the physics of pressurized steam. She explained that she'd been using it for 6 days. Harrison asked if she had authorization. Maggie admitted she didn't. He asked if she understood the regulations regarding unauthorized medical equipment. She said she did. He asked if she understood that unauthorized equipment could result in court-martial. She said she understood. Harrison looked at the device again. Then he looked at Maggie. "Lieutenant, this is the most irresponsible thing I've seen a medical officer do in 20 years of service." Maggie said nothing. "You built an unlicensed medical device from salvaged parts. You used it on patients without approval. You violated at least 6 separate regulations. You put soldiers' lives at risk." "With respect, sir," Maggie said, "I saved soldiers' lives." Harrison ordered her to dismantle the device and return to standard protocols immediately. Maggie refused. The refusal was unprecedented. Junior officers didn't refuse direct orders from superior officers, especially not in combat zones. Refusing a lawful order could result in immediate relief of duty, arrest, court-martial. But Maggie had numbers. She showed Harrison the infection data. She'd been tracking it privately in a small notebook. 127 surgeries before September 14th, 54 infections, 23 deaths, 42% infection rate, 89 surgeries after September 14th, 7 infections, 1 death, 8% infection rate. The data was irrefutable. Whatever Maggie was doing was working. Harrison faced a choice: court-martial a nurse for violating regulations, or acknowledge that her unauthorized device was saving lives that standard protocols couldn't save. He made a third choice. He ordered a controlled test, scientific method applied to battlefield medicine. For the next 48 hours, half of all surgical instruments would be sterilized using standard alcohol protocols. The other half would be sterilized using Maggie's steam device. The surgical teams wouldn't know which instruments they were using. Blind comparison. Results would speak for themselves. If the steam device showed no improvement, it would be dismantled and Maggie would face disciplinary action. If it showed improvement, Harrison would submit a report to Division Medical Command, recommending further evaluation. Over the next 2 days, September 21st and 22nd, the 351st performed 31 surgeries. Harrison personally oversaw the instrument allocation. Odd-numbered cases used alcohol-sterilized instruments. Even-numbered cases used steam-sterilized instruments. Neither the surgeons nor Maggie knew which instruments went to which cases. A medical clerk tracked the assignments secretly. The clerk compiled results on September 24th. Of the 16 alcohol cases, 7 developed infections, 2 died from sepsis, 44% infection rate, 13% death rate. Of the 15 steam cases, 1 developed infection. Harrison submitted his report to Division Medical Command on September 23rd, before the final results were even compiled. He'd seen enough. He recommended immediate deployment of field portable steam sterilization equipment across all 5th Army medical units. Division Medical Command received the report on September 25th. They requested additional data. They requested photographs of the device. They requested technical specifications. They requested a cost analysis. They requested procurement recommendations. They approved the concept in principle. But implementation would require proper equipment. Procurement would take months. Months of designing official specifications. Months of testing prototypes. Months of manufacturing and distributing equipment through supply chains. Soldiers would die while waiting for official solutions. Harrison made another decision. On September 26th, he issued orders to every mechanic and medical corpsman in 5th Army hospitals within his communications network. Instructions for building field improvised steam sterilizers from salvaged materials, pressure cookers, copper tubing, pressure gauges, heat sources, detailed specifications, safety procedures, operating instructions. The orders went out through medical channels, corpsman to corpsman, mechanic to mechanic, not through official procurement, not through logistics command. Direct communication between field personnel who understood the problem and could implement the solution immediately. By October 15th, 23 field hospitals across Italy had Maggie's sterilizer. Not identical copies. Each one was built from whatever materials were available locally. Some used pressure cookers. Others used sealed kettles or modified fuel tanks. Some used copper tubing. Others used steel pipes or rubber hoses. but they all operated on the same principle: pressurized steam at 15 psi for 15 minutes. Built from pressure cookers, salvaged tubing and scrap metal, operating outside official regulations, saving lives faster than the official supply chain could respond. The average post-operative infection rate in 5th Army field hospitals dropped from 41% in September, to 14% in November, to 9% by December. Conservative estimates suggest the improvised sterilizer saved 340 lives in the final 2 months of the Italian campaign. Soldiers who would have died from post-operative infections instead survived, and eventually returned to duty, or were evacuated to rear area hospitals for continued treatment. But Maggie's innovation faced resistance beyond the immediate medical command. Theater logistics officers questioned the unauthorized use of equipment. They argued that allowing field modifications set dangerous precedents. What if mechanics started building other unauthorized devices? What if medical personnel started inventing their own procedures? Military medicine required standardization for a reason. Some senior medical officers called it cowboy medicine, that undermined proper military discipline. They argued that regulations existed to protect soldiers from untested equipment. They pointed out that Maggie had no engineering training, no testing facilities, no way to verify her device was actually safe. Others argued that allowing nurses to contradict established protocols set dangerous precedents for military hierarchy. Nurses were supposed to follow orders from doctors. Junior officers were supposed to follow orders from senior officers. The chain of command existed for military effectiveness. The debate reached General Mark Clark, commander of 5th Army, in early November. Clark had a reputation for pragmatism. He'd commanded 5th Army since its formation in January 1943. He'd led the Salerno landing. He understood combat reality better than staff officers at rear headquarters. He called a meeting on November 8th. Medical command officers, logistics officers, Maggie and Colonel Harrison were both present. Then he asked one question: are soldiers dying at a lower rate? The senior medical officer confirmed: yes, sir. Post-operative mortality has decreased 34% since September. Clark asked: how much will official procurement cost? Logistics provided estimates: $23,000 for development, $180 per unit for manufacturing, approximately 6 months to first delivery. Clark asked: how much do the field improvised units cost? Harrison answered: approximately $12 in salvaged materials per unit. Available immediately, Clark made his decision. He issued General Order 47 on November 12, 1943. All field hospitals under 5th Army Command were authorized to employ improvised steam sterilization, using whatever materials were available. Official procurement protocols would continue in parallel, but field modifications were not only permitted, they were encouraged. Medical personnel were authorized to requisition salvaged materials from motor pools, supply depots, and damaged equipment. Mechanics were authorized to assist in construction and maintenance. Safety protocols were established. Pressure relief valves mandatory. Pressure gauges required. Maximum operating pressure 20 psi. The order was unprecedented. It acknowledged that frontline medical personnel understood battlefield medicine better than rear echelon planners. It validated field improvisation as legitimate military practice. It set a precedent that would influence military medical doctrine for decades. By December 1943, the Army Medical Corps began formal evaluation of field portable steam sterilizers for mass production. Engineering officers from the Medical Corps traveled to Italy to examine the improvised devices. They photographed them. They tested them. They interviewed the medical personnel who built them. They studied Maggie's original design. They refined it. They replaced the pressure cooker with a purpose-built stainless steel chamber. They added redundant safety systems. They designed a compact propane heating system. They developed a standardized model that could be manufactured in quantity and deployed globally. The M1944 field sterilizer entered production in March 1944 at a factory in Pennsylvania. It weighed 45 pounds empty, 62 pounds loaded. It operated on the same principles as Maggie's improvised device: 15 psi, 250 degrees Fahrenheit, 15-minute sterilization time. It had a capacity of 24 surgical instruments per cycle. It could run on propane, kerosene, or gasoline. Cost $340 per unit in mass production. Expensive compared to the improvised versions, but reliable and standardized. It became standard equipment in Army field hospitals for the remainder of World War II. It was used in the D-Day landing, in the liberation of France, in the final push into Germany. It was used in the Pacific Theater, Philippines, Okinawa, preparation for the invasion of Japan. But the official sterilizer didn't reach Italy until June 1944. By then, improvised versions built by mechanics and corpsmen had been operating for 8 months. They'd saved hundreds of lives before the official solution arrived. Maggie continued serving with the 351st Field Hospital through the Italian campaign. Salerno, the brutal winter battles at Cassino, the Anzio landings, the liberation of Rome. She trained medical personnel at every stop. She refined the sterilizer design based on field experience. She documented procedures. She wrote detailed instructions that were distributed through medical channels. She was promoted to first lieutenant in January 1944. The promotion had nothing to do with the sterilizer. It was routine advancement based on time and grade and performance evaluations. She never received official recognition for the innovation. No commendation, no medal, no mention in official reports beyond Lieutenant M. Hastings supervising nurse. The Army Medical Corps credited the development to field medical personnel responding to operational requirements. The invisibility was intentional. Army policy didn't encourage individual recognition for innovations that contradicted regulations, even when those innovations saved lives. Acknowledging Maggie's contribution would require acknowledging that official protocols had been inadequate. It would validate unauthorized field modifications. It would undermine the chain of command. After the war, Maggie returned to Philadelphia in October 1945. She resumed her position at Philadelphia General Hospital. She worked there until 1968, eventually becoming head of surgical nursing. She supervised 127 nurses. She trained hundreds of medical students. She modernized surgical protocols and infection control procedures. She never spoke publicly about her wartime service. When colleagues asked, she said she'd been a nurse in Italy.
Nothing more. She kept no photographs. She kept no souvenirs. She attended no veteran reunions. The improvised sterilizer was never officially credited to her. Army Medical Corps historical records attribute the development to field medical personnel. Some accounts mention Colonel Harrison. None mention Maggie by name. Margaret Hastings died on March 17, 1989, at age 74 from complications of pneumonia. Her obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer ran 6 paragraphs. It mentioned her 23 years at Philadelphia General Hospital. It mentioned her wartime service with the Army Nurse Corps in Italy. It mentioned her 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren. It did not mention that she built a device that saved hundreds of lives with $12 in scrap metal. It did not mention that she violated military regulations to do it. It did not mention that her innovation changed battlefield medicine forever. The principles Maggie discovered or rediscovered in that supply tent behind Salerno became fundamental to modern battlefield medicine. Steam sterilization under pressure, field improvisation when official supply chains fail, trust in frontline medical personnel to innovate under combat conditions. The understanding that sometimes saving lives requires breaking rules. Those principles saved lives in Korea when MASH units built improvised sterilizers from mess equipment and salvaged parts. They saved lives in Vietnam when field hospitals improvised solutions to tropical infection rates. They saved lives in Iraq and Afghanistan when combat medics adapted civilian technology for battlefield use. Every modern field hospital uses pressurized steam sterilization. The equipment is sophisticated now: electronic controls, automated cycles, digital monitoring. But the principle is identical to what Maggie built in September 1943. Most of them don't know it started with a nurse, a pressure cooker and copper pipes from a wrecked ambulance. Most of them don't know that the innovation came from someone who violated regulations because soldiers were dying. Most of them don't know Margaret Hastings existed, but you do now. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about nurses who saved lives with scrap metal and determination. Stories about people who broke rules because following rules would have meant death. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in World War II. Tell us if you've ever had to break rules to do the right thing. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Margaret Hastings doesn't disappear into silence. These heroes deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.